Neck-throughs, guitars, they're like a guy that you won't have a beer with you.
I want to hear what's pushing the notes.
Freddie King and B.B. King, Albert King, and let's not forget Burger King.
I don't want to blow my knuckle out.
Stainless steel is the work of the devil.
These go to 11.
From the East Amplification Tone Labs in Baltimore, Maryland, it's the Amps and Axes Show with your hosts, Jeff the Godfather of Low Wattage Amps Bober and Mick Marcelino.
Well, good day to you, Mr. Bober.
Good day to you, Mr. Marcelino. It should be a good one today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely. But you know what? It's always a good one.
You know what? It's true. It's always a good one.
The day we have a shitty one, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how that one's going to go. I'm going to record it. I don't know if I ever release it, but we'll have to sit around and listen to that one. But we have not had that, and we are now in our 5th year, buddy.
Man.
5th year. And thanks to who? Our fans. That's right.
We couldn't do it without you.
Oh, my God.
Or, like I always say, friends, relatives, acquaintances, neighbors, turn your cable guy onto us, whatever. It's all good. It's all good.
Absolutely. And as we always say, and we do say this, make sure that you tell everybody when you heard it, that you heard it here first.
That's right. And you may very well be hearing of this gentleman here first. Although, he's been around the scene for a little while on the left coast, and got called in to do some playing with some notable people, and now has started out on a little bit heavier material, but now has found that he really digs the blues.
Yeah.
So we are going to take a quick pause here. We're going to come back with our guest of the week, Mr. Alastair Greene. All right, and we are back with our guest of the week, as promised, Mr. Alastair Greene. Alastair, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, you guys. I appreciate it.
Oh, our pleasure, man. Our pleasure.
This was a per. Now this is kind of weird. It's a little roundabout here, Jeff.
Okay.
A little roundabout with the whole thing. So our good buddy Greg Mara.
Oh, yes.
Yes, you interviewed with him, and I was following you on Instagram.
Yes, we're all Instagram weirdos.
Yeah, and I was like, I'm checking out the stuff, and I'm going, well, you know what, man? We've had a kid that plays EDM. We've had everything under the sun. I'm like, you know what? We haven't had a rock and roll kind of blues guy. In the younger vein, we just had Eddie Clearwater on, who is
nice.
I think he is if you look up blues, you see Eddie's picture.
Right.
Yeah, he'll be there. He'll be there for sure.
The chief.
The chief, yes. And I was like, threw it out there. That's all I do. I just put it out there.
Man.
Hey, man, want to be on the show?
You did.
There he is.
I'm glad you did. Yeah. No, I've been following you guys on Instagram and checking out what you guys have been doing. And I haven't been stalking you guys per se. But, it's cool, man. I think that there's a cool community of guitar players out there on the social media, and it's nice to kind of connect with like-minded people from different, even if it's different styles and stuff like that. We're all guitar nerds at the end of the day, so we've got that in common.
Absolutely. And proud of it.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Wear your freak flag high.
That's right. That's right. Well, we're gonna get to see how you got to the freak flag, because we're gonna jump in the Wayback Machine and find out where Mr. Alastair Greene was born and raised, and how you got into this wonderful, wild, wacky world of making music. So,
well, that's a great question. I was born and raised in Santa Barbara, California, and in the early 70s, and I started playing music when I was pretty young. I started playing saxophone and piano about the same time, in about the 3rd or 4th grade. And so I was, doing that, and that was cool, and I was having a good time. And, my mom listened to like the Beatles and Leon Russell and Elton John and Stevie Wonder. And my dad at the time was more of a classical guy. And so that was kind of my musical, what I heard about music until sometime, I think like in like 6th grade, I started listening to the radio, and I don't remember what the station was, but they started playing songs off of Pyromania by Def Leppard. And it was much different than anything that I'd really heard at the time. Because I'm the oldest of 5, so it was kind of up to me to discover music up until a certain point before I started, hearing some of my friends or their older brothers playing music. So that was kind of the first time I was like hearing, distorted guitars and stuff, and I was like, that's cool. And then a friend of mine's older brother had like one of the early Iron Maiden records, like Killers or something like that. I was like, oh, that's, I was like, that's cool too. And so when I got to junior high, I was like, man, I want to rock. And that's when I started getting into like Maiden and Priest and Van Halen and Ozzy. And so I started playing the bass. Actually, I convinced the band instructor in junior high to let me borrow the electric bass that he had in his office. But he made me play the upright in the school orchestra. So that was my trade-off,
That's pretty cool, though.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
So I did that for a couple of years, and I was still playing saxophone at that time. I played sax all the way until like my first year of college. But so I played bass for a couple of years, and had a friend of mine who was a guitar player kind of showing me some stuff. And it was about that time, because I'm of the age where I kind of missed Randy Rhoads by a couple of years as far as being aware of him and stuff. But Bark at the Moon came out, and I saw pictures of Jakey Lee, and I was like, that dude's probably badass, And that was kind of what made me want to play electric guitar because I was just getting, because that was, we're talking about whatever that is, 83, 84, 85, and there somewhere. Yeah. And that was really, there was so much, coming out of LA, all the British hard rock and metal bands were happening, and all those guys wielded guitar. And regardless of what you think about those genres now, there's no question that all those guys were killer players. And so that was kind of how I started hearing guitar and wanting to play and just being interested in it. And, that was around the time Mike Varney got his label going. And so there was just a lot of guitar happening if you were aware of it.
If you wanted to hear, notes per second, it was shrapnel where you went,
Right. And so I was, I was just excited because there was guitar music and I was getting to hear it and stuff. And then, I started taking lessons. And at the time, my teacher was, my parents got me lessons with this classical teacher. And so he was, teaching me like classical, and, I love that stuff, and I obviously have a huge amount of respect for people that can play that, but that's not where my head and my heart were at. And so I was just like, that's cool, man. How about showing me the intro to like, Killer of Giants off of Ultimate Sin, or how about showing me D by Randy Rhoads, trying to find some common ground. And he gave me a tape, and I still have the tape. And on the tape, he's like, look, if you want to play rock or whatever, you got to start here. And so he gave me a cassette tape. And, it was Cream, Crossroads, and there was a little Hendrix on there, and there was some Freddie King, and there was, some of the surf bands and stuff. And so that was kind of my first exposure to that. And at the same time, I started to hear Led Zeppelin and the early Sabbath stuff. And so that's kind of when something kind of clicked. And a few years later, a friend of my dad's was like, look, I know you're playing guitar. Check this stuff out. And he gave me a stack of vinyl. And it was like Stevie Ray Vaughan's first 3 records, Johnny Winter, Second Winter, B.B. King Live at the Regal, Allman Brothers at the Fillmore East, and a few other things. And so there was something that I'd heard in Jakey Lee's playing and Eddie Van Halen's playing, and even, someone maybe like Vivian Campbell. There was something that I heard in their playing that I really identified with. I never got to a point where I could play like crazy fast stuff as much as I wanted to, but there was something in those guys playing And I realized, and I was at that time at least hip enough because I'd listened to enough stuff that I was able to kind of trace things back. Oh, those guys were into Zeppelin and Sabbath or whatever. And then, those guys were into Hendrix and Cream. And so I was able to kind of trace it because all of a sudden everything kind of made sense. It was like, oh, this is where all those guys got that stuff.
Right.
And if you're playing guitar, it's pretty easy to trace, man. It really is. It's not rocket science. You just listen, you just kind of go back and you read the interviews, and this guy listened to that guy, and then you go check that guy out, and that guy listened to whoever. And so it was a cool journey to take. And I kind of went back to blues and blues rock, and with my music, I've kind of stayed there, but I've obviously played a lot of different other kinds of music and with a lot of different kinds of bands and stuff. But that's where I found my home as a guitar player, doing what I like to do with singing and writing and stuff, was definitely the blues rock stuff. So
that's very cool. And, you say it's an easy thing to do. You go back and just, follow it back. It's a lot easier now.
Oh, well, yeah, it's a lot easier now.
It's a lot easier now. Because,
then you had to go to the record store.
Yeah. Well, you had to go to the record store or wait with bated breath for the next issue of Guitar Player magazine to show up to find out who's in it and what kind of story they're telling,
Yeah. Guitar for the practicing musician.
Oh, yeah.
And the one that always, the one story that always gets me is when you go, Eddie Van Halen, man, amazing player, everything, just, guy was an innovator. He was doing stuff nobody else was doing. Biggest influence, Eric Clapton.
Right. Yeah.
I've listened to every Van Halen album backwards, and I'm going, haven't heard of Clapton lately yet.
What's really interesting? I've got an interesting story about that. I've got some friends, actually a couple guys that were in my band early on. There was a band in Santa Barbara where I grew up called the Pontiacs that were at the time a pretty well-known and well-respected blues band. It was led by a guy named Mitch Kashmar that I played with a lot, who's a harmonica player and a singer. And because back then Santa Barbara was kind of more of a vacation spot for people would come visit town, and those guys were playing all the time, so people would just come and sit in with them. And so over the years, Stevie Ray Vaughan came and sat in with them at like a small little bar when he was on his way up. George Thorogood, every time he would come through back then, he would go and sit in with these guys. And sure enough, Eddie Van Halen came and sat in with them. And I was a kid, so I wasn't really aware of any of this stuff happening. But when I talked to my friends in the band, and I said, oh, so what was Eddie Van Halen like? And they're like, oh, he sounded like when he sat in with us, he's like, he kind of emptied his Clapton bag and then left. It was like, that's what he would go to, was that kind of Cream type of stuff. Huh. Because he probably wasn't playing with any distort. He didn't have his rig, so he probably played someone's Telecaster through like a super reverb or something. Yeah. And so that's where he immediately went with his playing, was back to that kind of stuff that didn't necessarily rely on the the overdrive and the gain and the volume and stuff like that. So that's what they said. They said, hey man, he sounded like Cream era Clapton when he sat in with the blues band.
Too cool.
That's I've not heard that before. That is pretty cool.
I wish. I don't have a tape, but just relaying things second hand. So sure.
Well, why would they lie?
Yeah, exactly.
Eddie came in and right. He did Disraeli Gears.
Could you imagine to just see that and witness that?
That'd be pretty cool.
You know what I mean? You'd be like going. Yeah, I saw Eddie Van Halen one time.
Right.
Well, every once in a while you luck out, and obviously seeing that like in a little bar would be unbelievable. I've got to see some people, sit in with bands that were really special, but they were, usually at, huge, bigger shows or whatever, but not in a little club like that. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, man.
Wow.
that would be, yeah. Phew.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like what did I just see? That'd be cool.
Yeah, and if knowing that it's Eddie Van Halen, and then him coming in and doing the whole Clapton thing, everybody had to be like, "What in the world?" It had to throw people.
Yeah, it might. I don't remember the story, and I could be getting some of this stuff wrong because it's been a long time since I've heard the story. But I think it was around the time that he'd like maybe cut his hair. And so it wasn't like there was a big scene. You know what I mean? It wasn't like it was like one of those things where people flipped out. It was like hey man, Eddie Van Halen's here. You want to let him sit? And it's like, or whatever. It's like, yeah, sure, send him up. And so, at a certain point, we're all just players, you know,
right.
and so once you start speaking the common language, which a lot of the time ends up being, some form of blues or early rock, everyone's kind of it's an even playing field at that point.
I mean,
or a little bit more even,
That's where rock came from.
Yeah, exactly.
That's definitely where it came from.
Yeah.
Wow.
So when was the when did you first go out with other people and start making music on your own? And was it covers, or did you decide to write your own stuff in the beginning?
My first band that I was in, we were trying to write our own material, and it was definitely, music of that, LA influenced hard rock. And this was right before I kind of had gotten into blues, was when I was playing in my first band. And, so we did a handful of gigs, locally. We went down and played the Troubadour in Hollywood a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, that's when I first started getting into blues and blues rock. And then I went away. I went to the Berklee College of Music for a couple years. I got a scholarship when I was in high school, and so I went there for a couple years. And when I came back, the first band that I got into, which I kind of refer to as my first serious band, was originals as well. And that was, I was kind of trying to do some sort of a Zeppelin-y thing, but it was definitely colored by the early 90s Seattle movement, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was original music. And that was when I came back, that's when I started to go and see these guys in the band, the Pontiacs and stuff, and sitting in with them. And when that band broke up, I had a band just for a couple of years which was a trio that was doing originals. And it was around that time that the bass player from the Pontiacs and I started doing a little bit of playing. And then he was still doing a lot of blues gigs. And so I'd start kind of going in and sitting in at these blues gigs. And I started kind of getting hired to be a second guitar player. And that was kind of when I went off the rock path and kind of got into playing a lot of blues. But then I also got hired to play like in an R&B funk band that was doing mostly covers. And that was around the time that I started my band. So I kind of had this original thing going that was, gigging a little bit, doing some blues covers and some originals. And then I was playing in a bunch of other bands, just basically playing every single gig that came up. And I was never great at playing like tons of other styles, but I knew enough and had played enough and, had a little bit of schooling so that I could latch on to and play stuff, nothing like progressive or whatever, but, if you have a feel for blues and R&B, you can get into a lot of other stuff. And so I, played in a lot of different bands and just doing covers and originals. I played like an Americana band that was mostly originals. I played with some friends of mine, like kind of in a heavier kind of Sabbath progressive-y rock thing.
Nice.
Had my band going. And then I was playing, and then that's kind of how I met Alan Parsons, was playing on the Some Guy's Country Rock record. He was doing overdubs at Alan's home studio. So early on, or I guess not super early on, but up until, 7, 8, 9 years ago, I was playing every single gig that I possibly could with anyone that would call me to play. And
I mean, that does wonders for your chops.
Yeah, well, in your ear, and
right.
and just the experience of, I don't even know how many, times you go and set up your gear, play the 3 sets and break down your gear. I mean, you do that enough and you just get, that's how you get seasoned. That's how you get used to the drill, as I sometimes refer to it.
Absolutely.
As. You got to go through the drill. You got to go do it. And doing that leads to other things. So,
Yeah, I mean, you don't know who's going to see you and what they have in mind or what they might have a need for.
Exactly.
So the Alan Parsons thing.
Yes.
That came out of you.
That came out of a session. Yeah, that came out of me.
But where did the session come out of?
Me,
Did it come out? The session come out of you playing in gigs?
Yeah, I was playing out, and this guy who was a DJ at one of the local radio stations had a band, and he was at some show, and he was like, "Hey man, will you play on my record?" And I did a few gigs with him, and then I went and did some overdubs, and the overdubs were up at Alan's home studio with this other engineer. Mm-hmm. So it was basically just, the Santa Barbara scene has kind of ebbed and flowed, I think, like a lot of music scenes in different towns. And it was actually pretty happening late 80s into the mid 90s. There's a lot of live music. There's a lot of bands, and a lot of bands out of here actually got signed to major labels in the mid 90s, and so it was pretty exciting. And so all this stuff that I'm talking about was kind of happening, in the later 90s after when I started playing in the blues bands and stuff, and into the early 2000s. And so there was kind of a scene, and I guess a little bit of a big fish, small pond type of thing for me. There's a lot of great guitar players everywhere. But some cities, you can throw a rock in a random direction and you're going to hit a great guitar player.
For sure.
But,
Nashville.
But yeah, exactly. So, but but at the same time, I was, kind of the roots guy, I guess you could say, the blues and kind of classic rock guy. And so I was, getting called for a lot of different stuff. And then that's how I ended up, meeting this, the DJ who had the country rock band and doing the overdubs. And then that led to meeting Alan. And that was like 2001 or 2. So that's how far back that goes.
Sweet.
Wow. So what was the project like with Alan?
Well, the first thing I did with him is I played on one of his records. Actually, the last studio record that he put out came out, I think, in 2002 or 3. Called A Valid Path. And so I'd met him at his studio during these other sessions, and about a year later he called me and asked me to go play on his record. And and that was really cool because obviously he's a big name engineer, producer, artist. Mm-hmm. But I went in to go record and play like a solo on one song and some fills on another song, and I was like, well, who else is playing guitar on your record? And he's like, oh, no one, just someone named David Gilmour, and so it's funny, like if you go look at that record, if you go find it, it's called A Valid Path. There, and it was very experimental. He did a lot of these, he was doing a lot of collaborations with a bunch of different bands at the time, kind of more of the electronic music stuff. And so the songs are kind of all over the place. There's a few instrumentals. But there's 2 guitar solos on the whole album, and one's me and one's David Gilmour. So, wow. There you go. Well, so
that works.
So that was, yeah. So that happened, around that time. And also around that time, I was playing with Ainsley Dunbar, who had moved to town. Oh. For those that don't know, he's the drummer that played with the early Jeff Beck group and played with David Bowie and John Mayall and was the original drummer in Journey and yada, yada, yada. He played on the big Whitesnake record with all the hits. And he'd moved to town and had been looking for a guitar player to kind of put something together with. So I was already kind of playing with him. We didn't actually go out and gig, but we did some recording and we rehearsed a bunch and had a bunch of stuff together. So I'd already kind of had a little bit of a confidence booster playing with him by the time, Alan called me to go play on his record. And so, a few years later, well, actually more than a few years later, like in 2009. So I, was playing in my band and a bunch of other bands. Alan called me to sub for his current guitar player at the time, Godfrey Townsend. He's a phenomenal guitar player. He played in the John Entwistle band and some other stuff. And he was playing with Alan at the time. So I went and subbed on a short kind of West Coast tour for him. And that was like in the winter of 2009. And then in the beginning of 2010, Alan contacted me and said that he was going to put together kind of a new band, let some of the old guys go, and asked if I wanted to play guitar. And of course I said yes. So I officially got the gig in 2010 and kept it up until, I guess, April of this year was when I decided that I'd, done it long enough and needed to kind of get back to my thing. But so, yeah, for 7 years, that was, kind of my main gig, and I balanced that with doing my band. And so I would go travel the globe with Alan and go play a bunch of fantastic places, and then get home and play blues rock with my band around California and the West Coast and stuff. So, but now, it's on me to keep my thing going. We just put out a new record this year, and moving forward with that.
Very nice. Yeah, great story. What was I going to ask? Recording with Alan. What's that like? And did you? Yeah, I want to go back. I always go back and see like what were the players' like first instruments, and do they remember them? Do they have them? And then amps. And then what was it like recording with Alan? What was that thing like? So give us some gear history there.
This is funny. So for the record that I did with him in 2002. His home studio was at this house in Santa Barbara, and it was kind of up this hill and this driveway, and then there's all these steps and blah, 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 blah. And so I went in and listened to the track first. And, like I said, he was doing all these collaborations with a lot of electronic artists. You'd have to forgive me. I can't think of all the different collaborations that he did, but there's a lot of that time in the early 2000s. He did a lot of co-writes with all these different bands for that record. So I heard the track that he wanted me to play on, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, I've got a 72 Super Reverb in the car, or I've got the Pod. and I was like, call me lazy, but I was just like, what do you guys, I could hike a 75-pound amp up 3 flights of stairs,
or we could
use
the Pod.
What do you guys think about the Pod? And it's like, fine. Here's the thing with amp modeling, and it, hopefully, obviously, it's great to move air and mic stuff up and everything. But if you're playing on some big production, the guitar is going to occupy, it's not going to occupy a huge sonic space if there's already keyboards and sound effects and drum loops and stuff.
Right.
And so, I would defy anyone to go and listen to that record and go, oh, that's the Pod, that's the whatever setting.
Right.
And so that's what I used on that. But that was just because I felt actually, honestly, that would kind of fit the mood of the music. It wasn't like it was some swampy Louisiana blues thing or something like that. It was like, no, man, it's electronic music. Plug in the Pod, it's going to sound fine. So that's what I used on that. But I didn't do a lot in the studio with him. I did a handful of things, because as I was saying, that's the last studio record that he's made up until this time, and he may make another one. I don't know. But I did do some stuff in the studio with him a couple different times. Early, I did something, or I'd just bring in a Les Paul and I think a Blues Junior, and we'd mic it up, and it would sound fine. And then after that, I started using Hughes and Kettner amps back in 2012, I think, or 2013, and so I used those on some of the other things that I did with him. I played on he did a couple of singles several years ago, and I played on one of those, and I think it was the Hughes and Kettner amp, and I think I played my Les Paul on that, and not a lot of pedals. I don't usually use a lot of pedals recording. If I try to get the sound from the amp, but it just kind of depends, but. Mm-hmm. And, it was interesting too, just, because it wasn't like he would labor over mic placement or whatever. He'd kind of go in, point the mic around, listen, maybe position the mic, and then go. And I think a lot of those guys from that era, it was just kind of about, I don't know how much of them got into the science of things as opposed to just, what do I got here and what do I have to work with, and let's capture a moment. And,
right.
And a lot of it had to do with just the gear of the time. I don't think they, I could be wrong. I know when he did, some of the Dark Side of the Moon engineering and whatnot, like, doing the loop for money, that took some doing, to get all that stuff lined up with the tape loop.
Right. But they had no technology. It was all physical things.
Yep. Yeah. You had to literally, I heard this story about them making the tape loop and stuff and all that. And so But I think a lot of those guys, that their talent was just taking what they had. I mean, you could draw a bunch of different analogies. It's like a cook. You open up the refrigerator. It's like, what do you got? If you know how to cook, you're going to make something good. If you don't, then you're bummed. And it's
a great
the same
analogy.
thing. I think it's the same thing when you're in the studio. It's like, what's the gear? Who are the players, and work to everybody's strengths, and you come up with something magical, and that's going to happen. Regardless if you have the right people there. I mean, you could have all the greatest gear in the world, and if you don't know how to use it or you don't have the right vibe, none of that stuff's going to do you any good.
Right.
So,
right. Polishing a turd,
So there's right, exactly.
Well,
And no one enjoys that.
Right.
No one has any fun.
The dirty job.
And this isn't. It's a sort of on the same level. Not really a loop, but when you hear the stories about Bohemian Rhapsody from Queen, that it was like somebody turned around because Brian was running the controls, Brian May, for the chorus, right? That big chorus that's in the middle of the song. And somebody turned around. It was like another engineer, and he went, "Hey, man, I can see through the tape." And May turned around. He was like, "Oh my God!" And they had recorded it so many times that the silver was off of the back of the tape. And he was like, "I think we need to stop."
Wow!
And that could have been completely lost. They were saying,
Right? Yeah,
Wow.
That's wild. Yeah, man. That's rock and roll lore.
Totally.
Yeah, man.
Totally.
That's good stuff.
So you mentioned, you mentioned a couple of guitars, but you also mentioned the Super Reverb. Is that your amp of choice? Has it always been? You probably didn't start with that, I would assume.
No, actually, I'm trying to remember. Like early on, I actually got the Super Reverb pretty early on, man. I got the Super Reverb in like 1991 or 2. So that was probably my first serious amplifier. I got it used at a store, so that was kind of my main amp for a long time.
Cool.
And I've had a handful of different things over the years, but that was probably my main amp, I would say, for a long time until I got, it depends on what the gigs are, really, because if you're doing it right, and if you're a working musician and you're playing the bars and the clubs or whatever, you kind of have to have not a ton, but a few different amps for the right occasion, because you don't want to bring to a knife fight, and you don't want to bring a pistol to the tank fight. So it's like you want to have the right amp for the room. You really do.
Sure.
And so it doesn't. So if you're playing like some tiny little place with a blues band, you can get away with like a little 112, low powered, whether it's vintage or whether it's a blues junior or whatever. That's going to serve that purpose. If you're playing outside, on a big stage, you can almost bring as much as you want to fill that space. You can bring the half stack or the full stack. So it just kind of depends. And like I said, I started using Hughes and Kettner amps a while ago, and with Alan I was using the Tubemeister series, which is a cool 36 watt head. And we were over in Germany, and one of the artist guys came to a show, and he's like, "Hey, how come you're not playing one of our amps with your band?" And I was like, "Well, I'm kind of a snob." No, I didn't say that, but I was like, I was just like, well, I usually for a long time I would use pedals in my band to get the tone, because I never had the right setup for the longest time of I like to have a sound, you listen to a lot of classic blues rock sounds, and they're not super overdriven, no, but they're not pristine clean either. And so I would usually have a overdrive pedal or two to kind of try and dial in those sounds, and that's kind of where I was at that time. So I started using something called a Pure Tone, which is a Hughes and Kettner amplifier that's not really high wattage, but it gets pretty loud, and it's really just a clean platform. You'd be hard pressed to turn it up loud enough so it started to distort. So I started using that a lot. as kind of my amp for the gigs with my band, and I would use that with an exotic. I think it's the AC booster. It's the yellow guy.
Okay.
So what I would base, and then I have I liked the exotic EP booster, that little tiny guy, the little one space clean boost. And so I basically run a guitar into the EP and into the AC into the pure tone, and sometimes I'd put like a little reverb box in there or something, and that was kind of the tone. But since I've actually started using the Tubemeister through like a 112 cabinet, I've been experimenting a lot with amps. I mean, that's kind of my new.
As you should.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton of them, but I've got a handful of amps. I've got a couple Fender things, and I've got the Hughes and Kettner stuff, and in between those, I can kind of pretty much cover everything that I need to cover tone wise. And I went back and started revisiting the Tubemeister for my band. And it's been good. I mean, originally I didn't think it had what I needed, but the middle channel has been kind of proving to be the champion right now. So I've been using that and a couple of pedals, and it's been working out.
Cool. Yeah, a lot of it is in the hands, and just knowing how to set the amp so that it works well with what you're giving it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's the tone search. I mean, it really is a rabbit hole. And at a certain point, I kind of just go, well, man, I don't want to spend any more time or money trying to chase down something that I may never find. It's just like, at a certain point, it's like, man, I just want to go make music. But it helps to have, a couple decent pieces of gear to kind of go and do that. I mean, you can't argue that, it doesn't matter what the gear is. Great players are going to make it sound great, which I believe. But I think it's more inspiring to have, some decent gear to play and get good sounds. Even when I still do some teaching, but I used to do a lot more of it, 10 years ago or so. And I would tell parents, they'd bring their kid in with a guitar and I get it. Not everyone has the budget to go buy, an instrument for their kid. But, if it's a cheap instrument and, it's a young kid that doesn't have big hands or strong hands, it's a fight and it's not fun. Right. Oh, yeah. And, and I mean, as much of a bummer as it is, and I would have to try and say in the nicest way possible, it's like your kid may not end up playing guitar because it's too difficult. I mean, if it's an acoustic guitar and the strings are an inch off the neck, the kid's really going to have to want it. And not to say like you need to go get some $3,000 Les Paul that plays like butter to like inspire the kid to play, but there's something in between. And I look at all the big famous guys that we all love. I mean, they're all using, killer stuff that they like to use because it inspires them, Oh, yeah.
True. But I mean, we've had this conversation plenty of times on the show where like early on in the early years of rock and people wanting to play guitar, you'd get the guitar that you could afford and the strings would be a half an inch off the neck. And, that really discouraged probably 80% of the people that wanted to pick it up in the first place. Yeah. Now, I mean, in this day and age now, it's substantially different because, I mean, it's right around Christmas time. You could walk into any music store and find, an Epiphone or a Fender beginner's pack with a guitar, a strap, a little cable, a little amp. And that guitar is so much better than anything you could have gotten 20 or 30 years ago in that price range.
That's a good point. Yeah, no doubt.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's just, it makes it easier for more people to want to continue because, their fingers aren't bleeding after an hour.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I just hope it, I mean, there's all these stories, death of the guitar and everything. I just hope the accessibility of decent stuff starts to, increase the popularity of playing again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, I hope so.
I talked to our good buddy Greg Morrow about that, and we kind of came up with an idea that, or a thought that possibly is just because the big three are putting out these statements that they're finding their sales declining. But Greg said, well, you're going to NAMM. He goes, why don't you count how many guitar manufacturers they are and tell me how the guitar is disappearing?
Right.
And I thought
That's a
about
good
it,
point.
and I went, well, that's true. Gibson sales are probably down. Fender sales are probably down. So's PRS. We can use them as the big three, right?
Right.
But, you know, you got John Sullivan from Sully Guitars. He seems to be doing fine. And
yeah,
it's like,
there's, you know, it's interesting. There are, you know, a lot of builders now.
I think people want the change, you know, they want the
Well,
variety.
and they want the variety. You know, a lot of those guitars aren't cheap either. So you're getting really people that are discerning, that are, you know, part collecting and also part want to have a really special instrument that's made for them.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I can dig, I mean, I'm friends with Mike Delaney, Delaney Guitars,
Yeah.
Doug Cower from Cower Guitars.
Yeah, Cower
You know, and
Guitars,
all those guys, you know, those guys make killer instruments. But, you know, yeah, they're not cheap. They're making those for people that really want something special, you know?
Yeah.
And
No, I agree. And I mean, you know, you look at Kiesel, they're actually affordable and very customized. And it seems like Jeff over there is pumping a lot of guitars out these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think, Jeff, we've been fed a little bit by the big three, that they, you know, they're crying a little bit, like, you know, hey man, we're getting beat up on. And it's like, well, you can't be king of the mountain forever. It's just impossible. They're not going to go anywhere. They may have to fire a couple janitors and a couple staff guys, but outside of that, and maybe, and I own a Gibson, so I can say this. It's sort of like, you know, I can make Italian jokes because my last name's Marcelino.
Right. You have a license.
I have a pass,
That's
right? But I can say this. Hey, Gibson, if you want to see production and your guitars do well, first, don't screw with them, because we don't care about zero frets and auto-tuning and all that crap. Anybody that buys a Les Paul doesn't want that.
No.
And two, maybe don't make a guitar that has $2 million worth of R&D and you can't sell them, called the Firebird X. I love that.
Oh, right. Yeah, you know, well, it's interesting, man. Yeah, because I mean, I'm a Gibson guy primarily. I also have a couple of really nice Music Man guitars. I've got a couple of the Y2D, Steve Morse model guitars.
Nice. You don't need a degree to work those. Those are pretty easy to use.
Man, no, and that's the thing, and that's, you know, part of what it is that I do musically. You know, there's certain sounds and there's certain identities and a certain connection to, you know, the Gibson instruments or the Fender instruments, because that's a large percentage of the records were made with those. So you just kind of identify with that. Yeah. But as far as like something more contemporary, you know, the Y2D to me is kind of like meeting in the middle between those two worlds. It's because it's, you know, Strat scale with the humbuckers. And that's just, you know, that's another fantastic instrument from another company. And those are reasonable. Mm-hmm. Those aren't, you know, super crazy. And, you know, I mean, they have some shapes that maybe aren't for everybody, you know, some of the different shapes or whatever, but for the most part, they're, you know, Strat shapes, and they got I think it's called the Armada. That's kind of a Firebird. I mean, it's a, you know, Les Paul kind of shape or something. Yep. But,
cool. Yeah,
man, it's you go to NAMM and there's just so much in the way of those things, and you know, I think it's healthy to kind of have that stuff, you know, just to have people, you know, making their own versions and things that they like, and even if they never get huge, you know, I agree with that stuff with, you know, Gibson. Just, you know, it's like leave well enough alone. But I think, you know, it just depends on, you know, who's running the company at any given time and who's in marketing.
Right.
And all those things.
Their stockholders are the guys who pretty much dictate. You know, they want to see sales, and they're thinking that they have to go and reinvent the wheel. And honestly, I don't know who they're talking to. Yeah. Because you know, anybody that wants that. Look, if you want that Les Paul sound, that's what you do. You go to to Gibson, you get a Les Paul.
Right.
I don't want to have I don't want to have to know like the history of Gibson to find out which one I can buy that's going to sound like a Les Paul. How about you just not try to break tradition and just keep a line of them? I don't care. They can do whatever they want. They can make another line. Just keep this one line the way that it was in the beginning. And I guarantee you, see, this is the part that gets me, because if they did that and if Fender did that, damn well, as much as I'm speaking right now, you two know they would outsell every other model they ever made.
Right.
Because somebody would go, well, I just want the 60 Les Paul. That's all there it is. There's the standard.
The Fender, the Fender standard Stratocaster.
Yeah, there's
the Gibson standard Les Paul. Yeah, it is what it is and what it's always been. It's not, I've got two Les Pauls. One, and they're both standards, but they're both pretty different guitars. Yeah. One's an early '80s tobacco that sunburst that weighs 8,000 pounds, and then the other one is I think it's a 2009, and this is actually I bought this guitar to kind of take on the road with Alan before I started taking the Y2Ds on tour, but it's chambered, so it's a little lighter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got the locking, like when you plug into the guitar, it's got like a locking jack, and it's got the locking tuners, which neither one of those I'd really cared about. I just wanted a chambered guitar just because I can't do the heavy guitar thing anymore.
You were getting a deformity in your back.
Totally.
At a certain point, it's just like, man, that's a young man's game, or it's just, you just, I mean, I think there's probably guys that, maybe just depending on where they wear the guitar, it's easier on their back, but I can't, I mean, for a lot of the gigs that I do that are the longer, club gigs and stuff like that, so I can't wear a heavy guitar for 2.5 or 3 hours. It's just not in the cards anymore. So,
what's crazy? So Randy Rhoads was not a tall man. He was a very short man, very skinny, very small guy. And he wore a 74 Les Paul, which is probably the weight of a Buick. And and he wore that thing, and he had that thing slung low. I mean, if you ever saw Randy, that guitar was down, right?
Yeah.
And I saw an interview recently of Angus Young, and they said, why not the Les Paul? And he said, I'm a tiny guy. And he goes, there was no way you could wear that thing for more than an hour. And I'm going, well, what's Randy doing? What'd Randy do that you didn't do?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Now, granted,
it's just those wimpy Australians.
Randy didn't do what Angus does on stage, which is an aerobics class for 2.5 hours.
Exactly.
That's a good point. Yeah, exactly. That's funny stuff.
Now, Alastair, you have did I see you with a 335 as well?
I do. I have a 335. I've got an SG. Like I said, I've got a couple of the Y2Ds, and I do have a couple of Strats. Actually, my first good guitar that I call it is a early 80s 57 reissue Fender Strat that I bought when I was in Boston going to Berkeley. That's a nice guitar. My very first electric was I think it was a Charvel, and I think it was called a Model 3, but I could be wrong. It had a humbucker and 2 single coils.
Sounds like a Model 3.
And Kahler tremolo system. So I had that, was my first guitar. And then at a certain point, I briefly had an Ibanez. I don't know if it was with the RG series. It might have been 2 humbuckers and a single coil in the middle and a Floyd Rose. I had that briefly, and then I sold that to get my my Fender Strat. It was there was a time when it was almost kind of like I traded in and sold my metal gear for my blues gear, basically.
That's pretty cool,
I had like a Randall half stack and an Ibanez, and I sold it and got a Fender Strat and a Super Reverb. So it kind of tells you.
You went from a hornet's nest.
Right.
To the
Angry Bees.
Yeah,
but I mean,
Bees.
Honestly, you take the Randall and the Ibanez, and blues doesn't sound so terribly good on that,
Well,
no offense to the gear, but
you could probably, get some sort of semblance of some sort of a sound or whatever. But I think
it's more for the metal crowd,
gear does kind of dictate what the sound is. And I'd at that time, I briefly had the Ibanez. For a short period of time, it was like late 80s, early 90s. I took a handful of guitar lessons from Bruce Bouillet from Racer X.
We interviewed him.
Yeah, we've had Bruce.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've remained friends. Like we kept in touch and whatnot. And I'll text him every once in a while, and I'll go meet him down in L.A. every once in a while. But so I was a huge fan of his playing, and still am. I mean, he's still putting out killer records and whatnot. And talk about a guy that's played a lot of different styles. If you go and follow his career, he did the Racer X stuff, but he also played in the Scream, and then the Scream turned into kind of a sort of a heavy, I don't know, kind of funk rock roots thing called DC-10, and he was in other bands.
He had that hand issue where he was having some severe tendonitis and was looking at like an operation, and he read a book on how to correct that issue, and he was playing with one finger for the longest time in the Scream, right? And that, I think that's where he
I think it was it might have been the post Scream band. I think it was called Epidemic. He played in a band that was really kind of heavy.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember our interview. But the one thing about that guy that I always admired, and I'm a huge Paul Gilbert fan, but if you listen to Racer X live, I think it's the first album, when they do their guitar solos.
The live record,
the
Extreme Volume 1, where they've got everyone takes a solo.
Exactly. Bruce's solo, even though he does a lot of sweep picking, it's very bluesy.
Oh yeah, he definitely did. He comes from the middle of America, where you played in bars and you're doing blues and classic rock stuff and everything. He's got a great feel on the guitar. I mean, he's known for shredding, of course, but he's one of, I think, just a handful of guys that do that kind of music, that can play, bluesy and with a lot of feel and feeling and stuff. It's because I think it's because of where he grew up and the bands that he was in before, he came out to LA and got into Racer X.
And Paul destroyed his hands.
Right. No, I haven't heard a lot of Paul's solo stuff, but yeah, I like that early Racer just because of just the sheer intensity and craziness of it all, from the guitar standpoint. But yeah, man, it's, the other thing that I noticed with a lot of those guys too, and this could, I haven't talked to Bruce about this, but you have to, in order to play that fast, you can't really play that heavy. I mean, you can't really lay into the guitar.
No, you're light.
And it's really kind of like that Muhammad Ali thing, where it's like, you gotta, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, type of thing. Yep. Where you can't, be laying into it. And I think that's part of why I never really got, technique up to a certain point, is because, I was spending all this time watching these, Stevie Ray Vaughan videos where he's strangling the guitar, and it's like,
exactly.
And he can, don't get me wrong. I mean, he could wield some really quick stuff, but it was a lot of hammer-ons and pull-out, stuff that. It wasn't like he was playing Yngwie runs,
right.
But I don't, and not to say that he couldn't if he didn't put his mind to it, but when you're playing with that much, you're moving that much air with your hand. I mean, you're really, hammering on the guitar.
Oh yeah.
I think it's hard to play, fast up and at a certain point. So
yeah, it's I had a guitar teacher and a guy named Vince, and he was a classical guy, and he, it gets almost into a science with some of the classical guys because of the positioning, right? They want to find out the strength in their hand, all that stuff. And he used to tell me, he's like, look, if you want to play fast, he goes, you have to kind of like loosey-goosey. You have to kind of like get really relaxed. And he goes, and if you got crazy action and you're using heavy strings and all this other stuff, he goes, good luck. He goes, because you kind of need to be that just kind of floating,
Right.
And it is true. I mean, if you try to move your arm fast and you're using all of the muscle, it'll slow up because the muscle will pull. It'll actually work against you, you know. And look,
they just can't move that fast.
No,
they're not meant to move.
That's
that
why
fast.
when you see welterweight boxers, you look at them and you go, the guy's in shape, but he's not crazy ripped, and he's throwing haymakers on this guy, and you can't see him. And the reason is because they're loose, You know, you gotta.
That's exactly right.
It's like you gotta be precise, but you gotta be loose, and you gotta. It's like
you know, it's its own art form, man. It really is.
Oh yeah. And it's not for everybody, and
yeah,
no,
I can dig
Thank
it.
God.
I went when we were on tour one time in Florida. Yngwie had just come out with his model of Seymour Duncan pickups, and I've known the Seymour Duncan people for a long. I've known Seymour since I was a kid, and so I've always had a relationship with them. And so I reached out to them like, "Oh, hey, man. Is there a way you can invite Yngwie to the Alan Parsons show or whatever? Just as, because I'm a geek, right? I'm like, hey, why not invite Yngwie to the show?
Totally.
I'm in his neck. So I ended up getting in touch with his wife, and
April,
it looked like
right?
they were,
April.
April. It looked like they were going to come at one point, and then it didn't happen. I was like, whatever, that's cool. That probably better for me anyhow. I probably would have been nervous or whatever. See that guy sitting there with his arms folded, like, what are you gonna do on the guitar? Anyhow,
with his glass of wine eyeing you up.
Yeah.
But so fast forward, I don't know, 6-8 months, he was on tour coming through here, playing where I live, the Ventura Theater, and so I reached out to her and went back after the show and was introduced. And I'd never, I was a fan when I was a kid, of course, all those early Yngwie records and stuff. And so, she introduced me to him as the guitar player with Alan Parsons, blah, 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 blah. And he was nice. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Because you hear all these stories about all these guys. And I'm sure there's truth to everything. But he was very nice. And we were talking. And then, there's a bunch of people kind of standing there. And me and him were talking about guitars and whatnot. And I was like, man, it's a trip, man. That scalped fingerboard. I've always wondered, like, man, how do you do that? And he goes, 1 second. Goes into his dressing room, comes out with his Strat, and then puts it in my hands. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this? So I'm standing there, and Yngwie hands me his Strat, and I'm like, what am I going to do? It's just like, so it's like I get my pick, and I'm like, just kind of it's like, I'm not even going to try and do anything because it's just, A, it's intimidating, and then B, that guitar, I could barely play it. I mean, it's like,
isn't that bizarre?
It's light, super light strings.
Yeah.
The when you say scalloped necks, I mean, if you look at that thing from the side, it's like,
oh yeah.
I mean, it's insane. I mean, you'd have to go look, tell your listeners to go Google, Yngwie neck profile or something like that.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's just these big scoops out of every fret. Don't get me wrong. When he looked away, I tried to like kind of, tear off a little lick or something like that when he looked away, because it's like, I'm going to see if I can wield something. But no, I mean, it was so, it's like, I know one of his exercises. I'm going to try and play it. But no, man, it's a different thing. It really is a different thing when you start trying to play these different styles. It's just, and that's, kind of the beauty of it too, man, is there's just all these different things that you can always be working on and cool stuff gear wise and all that stuff.
Yeah,
so
man.
That really does take a light touch. The first time a friend of mine handed me his scallop, he's pretty much got the Yngwie thing, on his guitar. I couldn't play it.
No, it takes a little bit to get used to.
A lot to get used to, because I guess I'm, my ham hocks.
I still practice, some of that stuff, because it's like I want to maintain a certain amount of technique and command on the instrument, for what I do.
Sure.
But it really does. I think you have to get into it. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not too late for me, but maybe it's not too late. But I think you really have to dedicate a lot of time into figuring out how to kind of get your technique. And then also, I think it's just people's musical DNA is different. I think, it's like athletes. It's like anything else. It's like, you're only going to be able to run as fast as, your body's going to let you at a certain point. Not everybody can, be the, the long distance or the fast, the sprinter or whatever. I think it's the same with guitar. I think you just, you have something in your playing or your DNA or your whatever it is, your musicality that's going to kind of steer you where you should be going. If there's some sort of sense to the universe, I suppose. So.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of playing, are you playing much? Are you touring? Are you getting ready to tour? Are you recording?
You know what? What did I do recently? Well, like I said, we just put out a new record called Dream Train that I'm really proud of. we had a lot of special guests on it. Walter Trout's on it, and Mike Zito and Debbie Davies. So I got some of my guitar heroes on there. And
Oh, nice.
from the blues rock world. So we did a West Coast tour when the record came out, in late October, early November. And when we got back from that, I actually went and I sub in Starship featuring Mickey Thomas. I do some shows with them occasionally.
Okay.
Because well, long story as short as I can make it, Kip Winger did a tour with Alan Parsons about 3 or 4 years ago, singing, because the regular singer had a previous engagement. So Kip and I hit it off, and there's 2 guitar players in Winger, obviously. Reb Beach plays in Whitesnake.
Yep. Love
and
Reb.
then John Roth plays guitar in Starship featuring Mickey Thomas. And he'd recently started doing that gig. The guitar player before him unfortunately passed away suddenly. So John came in real quick and started doing that gig. So Kip approached me, basically saying, look, Winger's going to go and do some shows. Do you want to, sub for John if it works out? And so a few years ago, like 3 years ago, I did a handful of shows with Starship. We opened up for Leonard Skinner in Florida and did the Leonard Skinner cruise. And so a few weeks ago, or a month ago, or whatever it was, John called me and said that Winger had a gig and there was a conflict, and could I do the Starship show? So I went and did a Starship gig, and then which is cool, which is fun, and playing those hits and the Craig Chiquito stuff and everything. And then we had some other kind of regional stuff and local stuff. And then coming up in the new year, I'm going to be going out to Memphis there's something called the International Blues Competition. And my band's not playing the competition, but we're going out there to kind of hobnob. A lot of the blues industry is out there at that time. So we're doing about 4 or 5 shows in Memphis in mid-January. We're going to go down to LA and San Diego. And then when I get back from Memphis, that next week is NAMM. So
we'll see you there.
We'll be doing, we'll be doing the NAMM thing. And then after that, we're going out to Arizona for a blues festival called the Yuma Boogie Brews and Blues Festival in mid-February.
Nice. Say that fast.
Yeah, forget it. Once you start saying boogie, blues, brews, barbecue, I mean, it's just the alliteration will just like kill you.
Get 6 beers in you and say it.
There you go. Then it doesn't matter anyway.
Boogie,
music.
We've got some other stuff in April, and then we're going back. I've been doing this thing in Vegas in September called the Big Blues Bender. Thankfully, they don't have barbecue or boogie in that name. But check this out. So I'm part of the last couple of years I've been doing this. My band's played the festival, but there's also a backup band that I'm really fortunate to be a part of. Check this out. It's called the Bender Brass. So you could say I'm going to go play with the Big Blues Bender Brass Band, backing up bros and broads.
There you go.
So I'm doing that in September, and that's really a great festival. It's there's a bunch of stages, and I think the headliner this year is Kenny Wayne Shepherd, and
nice.
Buddy Guy's played it, and BB King's played it. Tons of bands. So this year my band's playing it, and I'm going to be part of the Bender Brass, and that's a band that I can't stop saying B words now. It's just I can't stop. So the band backs up lots of artists, and they have what are called artists at large, where sometimes you can't bring in everybody's band, so you'll have some singers or guitar players that normally front bands, and they'll go and sit in with other people, and then they'll get their own set. And so the Bender Brass learns their material and plays with them. And it's really a cool opportunity for me because, the blues umbrella is enormous, and it ranges from, rockin' and even hard rockin' stuff to, some jazzier things and Chicago blues, Texas blues and whatnot. And so it's really cool to kind of learn some of these different artists' material and get to kind of keep learning the form, keep learning these different styles. And I think one of the reasons I'm able to do that is going back to what I was saying earlier, just playing with every band that I had a chance to play with, and just trying to be able to figure out how to do different stuff. I think at the end of the day, if you want to do music for, for a living, or, or as part of a living or a part-time job or whatever, it's nice to be able to do a few different things. I just think that opens up more opportunities for you. And I just feel pretty grateful that I've been able to do that. I've gotten to play a lot of different kinds of stuff with a lot of different kinds of people.
Well, we've had more than one guest on where the bottom line is, we've kind of summed it up to be just say yes and then figure it out.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that has given a lot of people a lot of breaks.
Yeah.
And in slightly different directions too.
Yeah, absolutely, man. No, absolutely. I think, especially if you're starting out or you're trying to kind of figure stuff out. I mean, there's obviously so many different ways you can go playing music, and they all have a cool aspect about them. Being in a band with your bros. Sorry, too many P's again. But seriously, it's like being, having your close friends and growing up and having a band and starting a band and learning how to write songs and then writing them and going and playing them. That's very, very cool. And then, being necessary. A side guy. Yeah, necessary. And then, being a side guy, that's a whole other, skill set, So
Absolutely.
I think, regardless of what it is, you start by saying yes and just seeing where it takes you. So,
yeah. And, the thing is, like, being a side guy, if you're asked to do something like that, they're probably asking you because they feel that you can handle the gig. You might be a little apprehensive about it, but they've already probably seen you play. Well, if they haven't, they're crazy. But if they've seen you play and like, okay, we'd like to have you do this. Are you available to do this with us? They already know, most of your capability, and they feel that you can do it. So
right.
You take the gig. And then you do a little woodshedding, and that leads there, and then that leads to something else.
That's how
people have
works.
moved along that way. Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. It's so cool.
So,
well, are you going to be on? Oh, go ahead, Mick.
Well, I was just going to say I wanted to make sure that I do my standard where I go. You got a website, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Of course.
And all your social media, and we're going to have that, and that's going to live underneath the show on ampsandaccesscast.com, and it will go in our archives, and it will live there in
perpetuity.
That's right.
Nice, man. Yeah. I got, if you can spell my name, you can find me, and if you can't spell my name, you can just put in AG Songs, my initials and the word songs, and you'll get there. And cool. Man, it's that's a whole other thing. It's, got to do the social media, got to do that stuff. Keep yourself out there, whether you're a band leader or a side guy or whatever, just to let people know you're alive.
You hitting the East Coast at any time that you know of?
I don't have anything right now East Coast wise, but that doesn't mean that I'm not trying. We're always, working on, finding festivals and gigs and stuff like that.
Well,
so,
Chesapeake Bay's Blues Festival's a good one.
I've heard of that. Yeah. So, it's like any other genre. There's a lot of bands out there vying for, just a few slots on these things, and I think, maybe with the blues world, it maybe a little bit more so, but there's a lot of guys out there trying to do it, that maybe don't need the money, because they have the day job, or they, have the day job or whatever. And so, a lot of times it comes down to like, how cheap can people get bands to play? Mm-hmm. And it's tough because you want to go do these gigs and you want the exposure and you want to go and play for people. But at the same time, you need to be compensated for, what it is that you do. And a lot of times, someone will come in and do it for cheaper, and it's hard. It's really, it's not, I don't think it's, competitive. It's just, it comes down to economics, it's like,
right. And there's not as many rooms as there used to be.
Yeah, not as many rooms. So it's interesting. I mean, that's not, an excuse or an out as to, why certain things happen or don't happen for people. It's just a reality nowadays that it's getting harder and harder to do live music as your primary gig. Part of that's because of the way music is consumed now, I think, and broadcast and not broadcast. I don't pretend to kind of understand it, but I feel like, music's been kind of devalued, I think, to a certain degree because of, streaming and downloads and whatnot. And it is what it is. but it just means that we all have to get more creative with how we get out there and how we, publicize ourselves and all that, and just kind of keep it going. So it's an interesting time. It really is with live music and trying to keep that a thing.
It is.
Yeah,
it is. Well, Alastair, good luck with trying to keep it a thing.
Yeah, man.
Thanks.
And make it what you do. And if you hit the East Coast, we'll definitely try to keep an eye out for you. We should see you at NAMM if the cards align.
I'm going to make sure I get in contact with you, man, so that way
I'm
going
to be.
shake a hand.
I know I'm going to be doing a couple things. Seymour Duncan just came out with a new fuzz pedal.
No, there you go.
Cool.
If you haven't, go to their website and check it out. I did the song and the video for the new fuzz pedal by Seymour Duncan.
Nice.
And so I'll be at their booth demoing it on I think Friday and Saturday.
Well, we may have to be there.
I'll be at the Seymour Duncan booth doing. It's called the La Superica, and it's this great little fuzz, and we basically re-recorded one of my songs using it. And went out to the desert and shot this cool video. So go check it out, man. If you like the fuzz, you'll dig it.
Nice.
Hey, I'll do one of those uncool things and just stand there in front of you, just screaming your name over and over.
Yeah, or better yet, or just cross your arms and don't say anything.
Yeah.
Hey,
by the way, speaking of that, right?
I'll do that one. You do the screaming. I'll do the crossed arms.
Let me. Yeah, exactly. Let me go out on a little bit of a rant here, because in this world that we are living in as musicians, okay, just as musicians, we're all trying to vie for a gig. That's great. That's called competition, and that's a great thing. But when you're going out and you're seeing somebody, you drove there for a reason. It's not to stand there and be a douche with your with your arms crossed while this guy's busting his balls. Now, maybe you can play it 50 times faster, but guess what?
Right.
You're not doing it at that time, so maybe lighten up a little bit. I see some of these guys, and I'm going, it's like, look, man, we're all in the same goddamn boat. I think it would be a good idea if we all rode the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, I may be insane here, but
no, I get you. I get you. Man, I hear you.
It's like, you're standing there and you've woodshedded how many hours, right? You don't know. It's countless hours, and you just want to present it across, and then you got this guy that's standing there just critiquing everything you're doing, and you're going, really?
Yeah, it's tight on. It's tough. Yeah, it's I don't ever think of music as a competition or whatever, but
It shouldn't be.
You got a lot of personalities in this walk of life.
Oh yeah, and with social media, Jesus Christ, it's like off the chart these days. You know?
It's crazy, man.
Yeah, the same guy that was yelling at Zakk Wylde for the designs of his new Wylde audio guitars. I said on the Instagram post, I said, now let's play this out a different way, and it's you and Zakk in an alley. What's your attitude going to be now?
Right.
Yeah, because after you finish pissing your pants, you're going to be, dude, I love you, man. I love you.
The thing is, especially on YouTube, you can have a username that no one can trace on YouTube, and you get these guys talking a bunch of smack, and it's like it's easy to talk smack when you
do it anonymously.
Yeah, exactly. Guitar Weirdo 74 or whatever your handle is. So you can go talk as much smack as you want. And there's not any repercussions. But yeah, show up at the NAMM show at a signing and go talk shit to Zakk Wylde. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that turns out.
And he's actually I met him once a long time ago, and he was a nice guy. So
he's a very nice guy. Yeah, but he's a beast.
But he will crush you with his finger. He will crush you with his little pinky.
Piss ants.
Yeah.
Right on, guys.
So I guess the moral of the story is lighten up, people.
Really,
just enjoy it for
Lighten
Christ's
up
sake.
a little bit.
You're going to go out to see music. Yeah. Don't be afraid to drop a couple dollars at the door.
That's right.
To pay for the guys that are doing the music. And then go and enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
Have a beer. Listen to the music. Enjoy yourself. Talk to people. It's a great night. Yeah. Enjoy.
Yeah.
And nobody's threatening you to stay there either. So if you don't like it, just walk away.
That's right. All right. Well, we're leaving this conversation, but we're all leaving as friends.
Sorry, I get so riled up.
It's good. I love it. It's good. Well, hey, thanks for having me on, you guys, and yeah, let's hang at the NAMM.
Yeah, man.
You know,
Absolutely.
And let's do it again sometime. It was fun.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Best of luck. Safe travels if you're traveling.
Yep.
And I hope 2018 is a killer year for you.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Thanks, you guys.
All right.
All
man.
good, man. Have a good one.
All right, you too. Talk to you
Take
soon.
care. All right.
All right.
And there you have the story.
I like that guy, man. What an attitude he had. He's such a nice guy. You could just hear it, you know? And he did all that metal stuff, and he chose to go down the blues route, but he still has that thing. He still appreciates it. I dig that, you know? Some of the guys out there, they don't want to even go in that neighborhood, let alone try it or anything.
And he was like, he didn't come from like the original rock camp where it's one step removed from the blues. He came from the, pretty much the next generation of music, which, is harder, I mean, style wise, it's harder music, but, owes itself to, rock and hard rock.
Oh yeah.
Which owes itself to the blues. So he had to go back like, 2 different jumps to find out where some of this stuff came from, and decided he liked that more than anything else. And that's just so
very cool, man.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
Best day of the week. And I know, look, I know I get on these rants, but Jeff, I just look at it as like, man, you know what? I'm not vying to be the next anything. Right. We do this podcast. This is what I do. I try, we try to push this information out to the other musicians that are out there, but you guys have got to stop beating each other up, man.
Yeah. I mean,
you know what I mean?
Just have fun when you play, have fun when you go out to watch other people play.
Exactly, man.
It's all good.
Yeah. Because look, there's kids with computers that are coming down the road, and they seem to be able to draw 40,000 people into a field, and I don't know how the hell they're doing that. So kind of embrace each other a little bit better.
Let's support the people that actually play something.
There you go. Yes.
Totally.
So until next time, my friend.
We'll support more people that play amps and axes.
I know it. I'm Mick Marcelino.
I'm just Jeff Bober.
And we're always saying,
onward.
Be sure and follow the show on Twitter @Amps and Axes. Also, make sure you like the show on Facebook. For news, comments, and everything else, visit the webpage ampsandaxescast.com. Thanks for listening.